letters from prison. What is the cost of our faith? What does it cost us to follow the path which is not of this world, to follow God? It's not popular, is it? Many Christians have died because of their faith. They've been incarcerated, harassed, beaten, called names. You Moonies. Actually, in Oakland, we wore that name like a badge of pride. We are the Moonies, mighty, mighty Moonies. But when people call it in hatred and with malice, then it hurts. And maybe some of you have experienced persecution. Maybe. And there's no shame in getting arrested for exercising your right to practice your religion, your freedom, because that right exists even in countries where religion is banned, for it does not come from man, but it comes from God. Many of you have been arrested unjustly. The thief on the right side of Jesus said, "But this man, he's done nothing wrong." The thieves were there because they committed crimes, but Jesus did nothing wrong. He was imprisoned, arrested, and crucified unjustly. Now, who's been in jail? That's it. I hope it was for soliciting without a permit.
Yes.
So I would like to share a few stories today about faith that has the power to overcome injustice and break down the walls of prisons. Where does that power come from? It comes from the truth. It comes from the truth when we follow the truth, when we cling to the truth. When communism took over North Korea, this was 1949, many people fled to the south to escape the repression, but Reverend Moon he did not. He traveled in the opposite direction, north to Pyongyang, where he began to preach. Has anybody heard this story? And Pyongyang at that time was called the Jerusalem of the East because there were so many Christians. Very soon he was arrested, tortured so severely that his lifeless body was thrown into the street and left for dead. But his disciples found him and they nursed him back to health. When he was sufficiently recovered, he resumed preaching. Arrested a second time by communist authorities, he was sentenced to 5 years in a notorious death camp. And Father has shared many stories with us about his time in the prison camp. He told us about when the prisoners lined up in the morning for inspection, and they had no warm clothing. And this was North Korea in the winter. And the teeth were chattering so loudly that it was etched into his memory. He can't forget that. He told us about how he would share half of his food. Nobody had enough food. They were all starving to death. And yet he felt like by sharing something with others, God would give him the power to survive. He told us about how when he was handling the fertilizer, and they didn't have gloves, that the acid of the fertilizer would eat the skin from your fingers and your hands. And he told us how when a prisoner died while he was eating, other prisoners would come and take the food from their mouth. But he told us that when he prayed in prison, he told God, "Don't worry about me. Take care of someone else. I will be okay. I'll survive this." After 2.5 years, the prison was liberated by United Nations troops, and he escaped to South Korea. When I was creating this sermon, I was thinking, yes, Pastor Riddick, she can hear this. But, so maybe her angels are here. His first church was made of what, Jack? Thank you, Jack.
Thank you, Jack.
But what he learned in that concentration camp was that communism is the enemy of God. And when he came to America in 1971, a large part of his ministry was devoted to what? Val? Anti-communism. Yeah. And his ministry was to illuminate the dangers of communism, so that when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and communism was defeated in 1991, Reverend Moon played an important role in that victory, in that miracle. And the path to victory ran through a North Korean prison camp. Let's talk about Dr. King. In 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King wrote his letter from a Birmingham jail. He had traveled. Hey, welcome. Dr. King had traveled to Alabama to protest the harsh treatment of black folk. Pastor Linda would say, black folk. He went there to protest the harsh treatment of black folk by police and was quickly arrested. In jail, he was able to read a letter written by 8 white ministers who criticized Dr. King and his methods. And the only way he could read this letter, it was in the newspaper, and they smuggled a newspaper into him, and then he said, I must respond. Of course, he couldn't respond to all the criticism that he received because it was voluminous. But he said, I must respond to this. And he didn't have any paper, so he wrote in the margins of the newspaper and on little scraps of paper, and they smuggled it back out, and his volunteers pieced together all these pieces of paper to create his letter. And his letter is one of the most persuasive arguments for civil disobedience that's ever been written. And Reverend Moon said that Dr. King is the greatest leader of the 20th century. Father said that. His letter described the discrimination and intimidation with which black people had to live. He responded to the criticism in a measured way. He was reasonable. When they called him an outsider, when they said, you're an outsider coming here to stir up things, he said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. When they said he should use the courts rather than protests and boycotts, he said, we know from painful experience that freedom is never given voluntarily from the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. But he insisted that his followers remain nonviolent. Where did he get his inspiration for that, Jack?
Hopefully Christ.
From Gandhi, from Mahatma Gandhi. And he cited Gandhi as being the person who showed an example, a Hindu, but he showed an example of how to right wrongs, how to stand up to power with nonviolence. I remember very well, I was sitting in history class. This is the day after Dr. King was assassinated. And our history teacher, his name was Mr. Whitaker, and he said, he explained to us, this is in Morehead City, North Carolina. A small, this is 1960, anyway, late 60s. And he explained to us the reason Dr. King was so important and so great was because he insisted that his movement and his volunteers remain peaceful, nonviolent. They asked everybody that wanted to volunteer and be a part of this, can you take a blow and not retaliate? And if their answer wasn't, yes, I can do that. I can be hit, I can have the dog sicked on me, and I'm not going to fight back. Then we can only use certain people. Dr. King, the greatest leader of the 20th century, according to our true father, didn't live to see it, but our laws today mandate equal treatment for all people. And the road to equality went through a Birmingham jail. Has anyone ever heard of Alexei Navalny? Navalny? Anybody? Alexei Navalny? Jack? Who's Alexei?
I just know his name.
Okay.
Some Russian dissident, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, he's a Russian dissident. He created the Anti-Corruption Foundation in Russia to expose corruption, bribes, theft by Putin and Russian oligarchs. Oligarch is, I guess, a wealthy millionaire, billionaire Russian who amass great wealth by illegal means. But Navalny was he wanted to take Russia back from those people, and so he started this anti-corruption foundation. He also ran for office, the mayor of Moscow, and then he ran against Putin for president. Of course, he was arrested many times, but and he became a mythic figure in Russia. I mean, everybody knew who Navalny was, and he was widely respected, even though maybe not by people that liked Putin, but the people of Russia knew who he was very well. And in 2020, he was poisoned by Putin's agents, and he would have died, but his lawyers were able to get Russia to send him to Germany, where he recuperated, and he recovered his health. He got strong again, and then he said, "I'm going back to Russia." And they asked him, when he came back, he got arrested right away. Right? He was arrested immediately, and people would ask him, "Why did you come back? Do you have some kind of special deal we don't know about?" Everybody assumed that. First, he was sent to a regular prison. Then he was moved to a high security prison. And finally, he was transferred to a death camp in frozen Siberia. In prison, and his recent book, a lot of it is a prison journal. And he explains, in prison, very simple things. A warm drink, a blanket. These are treasures in prison. A spider can be a friend, someone to talk to. He was in isolation much of the time he was there. And originally, Navalny came from a background as an atheist, but he came to realize that the teachings of Christ gave him the power to be able to risk his life on a daily basis to save his country. And he credits his wife, Yulia, for her strength. For who among us can walk this path of self-sacrifice without our beloved, to share our failures and our doubts and our victories? Why did you come back to Russia? He says, I have my country, I have my convictions, and I don't want to renounce either my country or my convictions. If your convictions are worth anything, you should be ready to stand up for them, and if necessary, make some sacrifices. And if you're not ready, then you have no convictions at all, just thoughts in your head. Corruption in Russia today remains rampant under the corrupt dictatorial leadership of Putin. And Navalny died under mysterious circumstances in February of last year in the Gulag. But his sacrifice was not in vain, because the Russian people will rise up and overthrow this illegitimate government. And the journey to, that's what I believe, and the journey to freedom runs through a frozen prison camp. And let's look at one more example in the Bible, Acts 16:25. But at midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. They were praying and singing in a prison. Okay, they were arrested, they were thrown into jail, and they were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. As it says in our holy song, so a dungeon may be Eden. They were sharing their faith with the prisoners, and all of a sudden there was a great earthquake, so that the foundations of the prison were shaken, and immediately all the doors were opened and everyone's chains were loosed. Paul's jailer thought, my prisoner has escaped. And he was, he'd been asked to keep this guy overnight. So he was going to kill himself because he knew he was going to die. But Paul called to him from the darkness and said, I'm right here. And that day, the jailer and his family were all saved. So God was with him in that prison. So this morning, we've been talking about 4 great men of God who were unjustly imprisoned, but they never wavered in their faith and their determination. Satan wants us to feel that we're alone, but we are not. Does anyone remember Luna Lovegood? Who's Luna Lovegood?
Reading Harry Potter.
Yeah, she's in Harry Potter. And she said to Harry Potter, when times are hard, it's important not to feel lonely. Because if I were Voldemort or Putin, I would really want you to feel lonely. Brothers and sisters, whatever you go through, you're not alone. And I already prayed once, but please join me for one more prayer. Heavenly Parent, thank you so much for the message this morning. We have been through a lot, and we know that it's a requirement that your people, your sons and your daughters who love you, go through a lot, because we'll do anything to save this world, because we've already been saved. We already know your love, but there are people who are on the fringes of the darkness who have no idea that through you, real life exists. And without you, that is no life. That is just darkness. No purpose, no meaning. So we're grateful this morning. We're just grateful we could spend some time together. And we're really looking forward to receiving special grace. We know many of us are going through the ceremony this morning. But Father, you've already given us so much grace through our true parents. And we just thank you this morning for that as we offer this time to you, praying in gratitude, attending Heavenly Mother Han as Blessed Central Families. Right? Thanks, guys.